Verse 1 is clear that Abram must leave something behind before he is able to obtain the promises of God, and here he must leave behind land. This had to have been difficult because Abram had to leave his family. Genesis chapter 12 verses 1 through 3 repeats a promise that God had said to Abram. God repeated the promise now that his father was dead, and Abram was compelled to a more complete obedience. But the promise was not taken away due to only partial obedience from Abram. But the promise was delayed, and this is a principle that many of us experience today. God tells Abram that he will make his name famous, which he does, as Abram's story is only beginning. In chapter 11, we read a lot about the plans of man. But in chapter 12, at least to this point, we see God's plans. We read a lot about I will, God will. And if God says something, then it will happen eventually. But as with Abram, like for each of us, in God's timing. We are not always ready at the exact moment for the promise, but God's timing is best. It's important to remember that Abram's dad, Terah, was not a Christian and worshiped false gods, so it's probably safe to assume that Abram's beliefs were pagan. But we cannot be certain about this. God does instruct Abram to leave the land, but he also promised to give him land. And from this land will a great nation be made. In Genesis 11 verse 30, the reader hears that Sarai is barren. This seemingly small detail in the genealogy of chapter 11 becomes a point of narrative tension in Genesis 12, when the Lord promises that Abram and his descendants will become a great nation. Again, God's promises will be met, and our actions do determine such promises. These promises were made to Abram, but they were based on obedience from Abram. And one was God blessing those who bless Abram, and it's through Abram that we are blessed. Not only was Abram promised blessing, but God also promised to make him a blessing, even to the point where all the families of the earth would be blessed in Abram. We read about Lot going with Abram. And while Abram was obedient to go out of this land, he takes Lot with him, so it's hard to say this was full obedience. And this happened at the age of 75, so Abram was not young when he left, so I imagine that it was probably even more unheard of for Abram and Sarai to have children. Abram came into Canaan as a stranger, and once there, he would come upon a notable oak tree known as the Oak of More. More is Hebrew for teacher. And it was common for cults to use nature, particularly trees, for messages from their gods. God does appear to Abram once they arrive in Canaan. And while Abram never owned any of this land, God's promise was enough evidence to assure Abram that he did indeed own the whole country. While we only assume, up until chapter 12, Abram had been of secular beliefs, so building an altar to God was something special, and this is similar to chapter 4. And how the people of land called on the name of the Lord after the banishment of Cain and the birth of Seth, even in the land God gave him. Abram never lived in a house, he always lived in a tent. And this is interesting, as tents are the home of those who are just passing through and do not put down permanent roots. When a famine hit the land, Abram went to Egypt. But Abram was wrong in thinking God would not provide for his needs in the place where God called him to live. God did protect Abram while in Egypt, but this was not part of the instructions. And we will learn, Abram came away with extra baggage. It is important to read verses 11-13 together to understand the full context of the scene which unfolds. For the first time, we get a glimpse of Abram's fearfulness in spite of his belief in the promises of God. And we see this in the form of the lie. The lie told was Sarai was Abram's sister, but she was his half-sister. And while it was a small lie, his intention was to deceive fully. The problems exists because he is just an immigrant seeking food for his people. From Abram's perspective, so he's wondering what's to keep the Egyptians from killing him to get his wife. As Abram feared, Sarai's beauty was an issue as she was seen and taken to Pharaoh's home. Not certain as to why this lie was used, but one reason may be that Sarai's husband would have had jealous seekers. But her brother would not have been a threat, so Abram came from a place of safety and concern. There are resources that suggest Pharaoh married Sarai, but this is not certain. And just one translation, but if this happened, Sarai was probably just one of the Pharaoh's wives. While the marriage is uncertain, Pharaoh did make some kind of payment to Abram, which included livestock, work animals, and human servants. Abram's scheme had increased his wealth, but lost him his wife. Despite what Abram had done, God does intervene, including the Lord afflicts Pharaoh's household with great plagues or diseases. Some scholars understand these plagues to be diseases of the skin. The Egyptians, those superstitious people, would have understood correctly that such plagues were a punishment for sin. Pharaoh is understandably upset with Abram, as he received great gifts of livestock, work animals, and human servants, all while remaining silent about the truth. Pharaoh summons Abram into his presence and begins to question him harshly. Think about what is on display. A pagan king recognized the moral crime of taking another man's wife, not Abram, but his deception nearly cost him his wife. Pharaoh concludes by returning Sarai to Abram and telling him to take her and go. What we see here is clear. It is becoming clear that God's promise to Abram is completely one-sided. No matter what Abram does, God will keep his promise to bless Abram, to protect him, and to make him and his offspring into a great nation. From Charles Spurgeon's November 29, 1868 sermon, Epitubal Calling, he explains, if you desire to know the character of a child, you will probably learn much about it from observing the father. The young bird flies and sings as its father did before it. If we would know the life of the child of faith, we should study the history of the father of the faithful. Abraham, the man of faith, is a type of all believing men. And the narrative of his life, if rightly considered, is the mirror of the history of all the saints of God. The commencement of his career of faith, when he first became separated from his own country and went into the land of Canaan, is a most instructive representation of our effectual calling, when we are, by a work of omnipotent grace, separated from the world, and made to obey the great precept, Come ye out from among them, be ye separate, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and will be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters. Genesis chapter 12 shifts the story to Abram and his journey on into the land of Canaan. God promises to make Abram the father of a great nation, and to give Abram's descendants that very land. Spurgeon's sermon continues, the life of the believer is as Abram's was, a separated life, a life regulated by other affections than those which arise from the relationships of flesh and blood, a life of walking in the unseen, in which God's command, presence, and approval are paramount considerations, and faith guides the soul, sitting like a pilot at the helm of the vessel. Abram denied the flesh, took up the cross, went without the camp, became sanctified unto the Lord, and lived and died the friend of God, and a stranger among men. The commencement of his separated life is a lively picture of the commencement of the same life in ourselves. The calling of Abram is a representation of our calling. And to that matter I shall ask your earnest attention this morning. Catherine M. Schifferdecker explains, now, we have met Abram before, but only as one person in a genealogy at the end of Genesis 11, the genealogy of Shem, one of Noah's sons. What we know about Abram is that his wife's name was Sarai, that he moved from Ur in latter-day Babylonia to Haran in latter-day Assyria with his father, and that Sarai was barren. Genesis 11 verse 27-32. She explains the promises are threefold. It is threefold. Descendants I will make of you a great nation. Genesis 12 verse 2. Land to your offspring I will give this land. Genesis 12 verse 7. Blessing I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. Genesis 12 verse 2. This promise is pure grace, but it may offend many modern readers. We who want everything to be fair are affronted by the idea of election. Why would the God of the whole cosmos, the Creator God, choose one particular human being, one particular family, one particular nation, above all the other families, nations on earth? Does God play favorites? Further, God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12 sustains Abraham and Sarah and their descendants in faith even when they don't see its fulfillment. The promise to Abraham establishes him and his descendants as conduits of God's blessing for the whole world. And through this promise, God binds God's self to this people forever. For these reasons and more, Genesis 12 is a key text on which to dig deeper into. Again, what we see is God blessing Abram even when he didn't do what he should. God continued to protect Abram, even when Abram acted like a liar. God did not call back his promise to Abram, because the promise depended on God and not on Abram. Spurgeon continued, "Ye have been reading the whole of the story, and therefore I shall only need to refresh your memories with it. Read carefully the last verses of chapter 11 and the whole of chapter 12, and get the thread of the story." Abram's call was, in the first place, the result of the sovereign grace of God. The world, as a whole, was lying in heathenism. Men had gradually gone astray from the one God to the worship of graven images. Here and there might be an exception, as in the case of a Job or a Melchizedek, but thick darkness covered the people. God determined that he would select one family which should afterwards grow into a distinct nation to be the conservators of the true faith. Why he selected Abram, he himself only knows, for we know that Terah, the father of Abram, had declined into the worship of false gods. And from Spurgeon, but let's end here with his sermon, he call of Abram, in the next place, was divinely applied and enforced. We neither read that an angel called him, nor a prophet, nor that he came out of Ur of the Chaldees, by the motion of his own mind spontaneously. The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham, says Stephen in his dying address, when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Charan. There was made to his mind a remarkable revelation of the existence and the character of the one only true God. And then after he had been enlightened, so that he knew in his inmost soul the existence and glory of Jehovah, then the message came, perhaps in audible sounds, perhaps by a forcible impression upon his mind, "Get thee out hence from thy kindred, and from thy father's house." Now mark, that in every gracious call by which a man is truly saved, the call comes immediately from God himself. As we see in the 12th chapter of Genesis, we see elsewhere and is present still today. And that is God's use of flawed people, whom he blesses despite their sin, is a crucial point in understanding our relationship to the Lord.